Okay, all right. My name is Luke Tomlin, recording from the comfort of my own home, and I'll be presenting with Casper Lee and Callum Tuffield to talk all about cohort studies. So for the presentation outcomes today, hopefully by the end of today, we're basically going to start with defining a few key terms in study design to give you some relevant background information and context to hopefully help you better understand the material within our presentation. Then we'll focus specifically on which study design elements relate to cohort studies. And then we'll look at when cohort studies are used, what they involve, why they're useful, and how they're conducted. And we'll use some real examples to provide some additional clarity and context. Finally, we'll discuss some strengths and weaknesses of the method, and from there we'll just recap, have a bit of a summary, and open up any questions to clarify anything that might not have been discussed. So, as a general overview, we have quite a few different study designs that are used within different contexts. So studies can be more descriptive in nature, such as qualitative studies using surveys and interviews, for example. And then we have analytic studies, which are more quantitative in nature, which usually contain larger sample sizes and look at analysing data points between exposed versus unexposed groups. So today we'll be focusing obviously primarily on cohort studies, which fall under the analytical observational type of study design. So we'll discuss briefly what that actually means in just a second. Cohort studies are both analytical in nature, meaning they compare data between a sample of exposed and unexposed groups to estimate the risk of developing a particular outcome. And they're also more observational in nature, which means they merely observe the groups without altering exposure to a particular factor. So they're non-experimental in a sense where you're not implementing a control or experimental group, you're not trying to attempt to simulate conditions. They're also a type of longitudinal study which is a type of study that collects data over time to observe potential relationships between exposure and develop a particular outcome, where data can be collected for many years in a lot of cases. Now, a cohort is simply just a group of people or items that share similar characteristics or experience within a given time period. And when it comes to cohort studies, generally the most common cohorts you'll see are relating to birth and aging, medical and epidemiology studies, so obviously very relevant to the coronavirus and everything that's going on at the moment. And they also look at social, cultural and political change over time. So with these definitions in mind, a cohort study is basically a long-term study that observes analytical changes between sample groups at different points in time to calculate the associated risk in developing a particular outcome, of which there are two main types of cohort studies. There are prospective cohort studies, which start in the present and observe development of a particular outcome in the future. So from present up to the future. And then retrospective cohort studies are the opposite in that sense, where they start from the past and then they look for potential relationships that develop up until the present. And as a general overview of cohort study design, you basically have a disease-free cohort in the beginning. So participants are selected on the basis of exposure and should be free of the outcome at the start of the study, which we see here. And then we basically monitor exposed and unexposed cohorts over time to determine the rate of incidence of developing that particular outcome or a particular outcome. And then we compare the two groups to calculate the relative associated risk with that outcome. So again, you have the disease-free here, you have your exposed cohort, unexposed cohort, a sufficient time lag, and then the difference between the difference in incident rates are compared between two groups. And this is just a little bit more of a visual example to see how you have your respective cohort studies here that start from the present and look for developments in the future. And then we have our retrospective studies, which start or look at the past and then look for development up to the present. So from here, I'll pass you over to Caspar, who will talk about why cohort studies are used, and talk a little bit more detail in terms of the measurements that they look at. Okay.
So a big reason why cohort studies are used is because you can actually quantify the incidence rate and risk ratio, which are calculated from the two groups and the data that you have collected. To calculate the incidence rate and risk ratio, you use the equations that are on the slide right now. And the incidence rate measures the frequency or rate of a particular outcome. So it would be how many people have the desired outcome at the time that you have collected the data at the end. And the risk ratio is how many times more or less likely an exposed person develops an outcome relative to an unexposed person. So an example of this would be if you were exposed to coronavirus, how many times more likely are you to develop it in relation to an unexposed person? However, some considerations must be taken when using this research method. The types of research questions that are best suited for this design are associations between exposure and outcome over long term, usually over at least a couple years. And in studies which you want to calculate an incidence rate to assess whether exposure and outcome are linked. So such as is if you wanted to find out if smoking was linked to lung cancer later on in life. There are times when you wouldn't use this research method necessarily. Some examples of this would be if there is a short-term time limit on the project, because usually a cohort study has to be done over a few years. So if you have a time limit, you won't be able to gather enough data, or the desired outcome wouldn't have been developed yet. If the exposure changes an individual permanently, i.e. if they lose a limb and that's the exposure, then you wouldn't use this research method. If there is no effective way to keep in contact with the individuals, so if you cannot follow up after the first data collection, then that means you're losing out on data that you can collect, which then will cause bias in your study. If you're trying to measure the incidence rate or the risk ratio of a rare disease, you may not have a sample size that is big enough, which then means that you don't have sufficient power in your study. Some ethical considerations of this research method include if the induced exposure by the researcher could change the individual's behavior. So referring back to the example of is smoking linked to lung cancer, if you had a non-smoker and you put them in the exposed group, you're forcing a participant to smoke, which will probably lead them to drop out and cause bias in your data. And you can have selection bias, where the participants you have recruited may be different to non-participants. So the participants may be healthier. Some strengths of a cohort study include You can quantify the incidence and associations. So the incidence rate, which you can calculate. You can measure multiple exposures for a single desired outcome. Cohort studies often include large sample sizes. So you gather masses of data for it. It has a clear temporal sequence, meaning that it can show that one thing leads to another and not the other way around, like smoking leads to lung cancer. You can calculate a risk ratio from it, and it can measure a lot of outcomes from one singular exposure. But some limitations of a cohort study is that it is very costly and time consuming because you have to follow up, and this usually takes years. It is very easily subject to bias and misinterpretation. This could be from the participants or just not being able to follow up. Rare outcomes, such as a rare disease, will require a very large cohort, which it's not always possible to get. And the classification of outcome, for example, like a diagnosis of a disease, may change over time. The exposure of the cohort study may also be associated with the reason of dropout, meaning that you will lose sample size in the group. And a cohort study cannot determine causation. So it's not definitively causing this one thing is the only thing that causes the outcome. An example of a study which has used a cohort study design is this one here. For this study, their aim was to determine the relationship of tobacco smoking to mortality in Australia. They used a cohort of 45 years and older men and women, and they were part of a study that was done in between 2006 and 2008 in New South Wales. The cohort included current and past smokers and people that have never smoked before. The researchers in this study performed repeated data collection on smoking status using questionnaires that were sent out to the participants. And then they took the death data from death registrations in New South Wales, which was available for access to the researchers here. After conducting their data collection, they found that 2/3 of deaths in current smokers can be attributed to smoking, and cessation of smoking reduces mortality compared to continuing to smoke. And the earlier you quit, the greater reduction in mortality rate you have.
All right, guys, we're going to look at a case study of a cohort study to finish off. This should inform you of a bit of extra insight into a case study. So this case study is called EnvironAge, and the cohort profile looks at the environmental influence on early aging. So why was this study done? Well, although aging is universal and unavoidable, aging doesn't occur in a uniform way. So EnvironAge aims to explore new understanding and dimensions of measurement for aging, and also to explore the interaction of environment with aging. When was this study performed? It started in 2010, and people were recruited through to 2015 on weekends. Now, who was recruited? They were newborn mother pairs from the East Limburg Hospital in Genk, Belgium. The catchment area of this hospital included the province of Limburg, with a variety of urban, suburban and rural areas, and an average population density that ranged between 82 to 742 people per square kilometre. The total cohort population was 1,080 singleton babies. So how often were the follow-ups for this? Initial follow-up was 4 years post-birth, with another one at 6 years, and then another at 1 pre-adolescent age, so sort of before the age of 14. Now, this study had a variety of measures in it. But to simplify it, there was characteristic and personality and lifestyle questionnaires. There was diet questionnaires. And then in terms of physical measures, they started to measure ambient air pollution in the area around the mother and newborn's house using a spatiotemporal interpolation method. They also took an indoor air pollution through a hanging air sampling system. So that was the mother's and newborn's house as well. And they also took traffic indicators around the residential area through a variety of distance to major road measurements and traffic density measurements. In a combination with pollution, they looked at residential greenness and assessed this via a normalized difference vegetation index. In combination with that, they took biological specimens, which differed between the initial measurement and follow-ups. At the initial measurement, they took umbilical cord blood to get DNA, RNA, and blood chemistry, as well as placental samples from the mother's side. At the follow-ups of 4, 6, and pre-adolescent, they took buccal cell swabs, saliva, and nail clippings, as well as, if the mother consented, urine and blood samples. And these were used to show biomarkers of acrylamide, and this is basically a parent chemical to other chemicals used in industrial processes, highly found in processed foods. Now, what did this study find? Currently, the study's in its first stage and thus limited in terms of the findings. But what it did find is, on the screen is an excerpt from the paper, which shows air pollution exposure during pregnancy induces molecular, cellular, and hormonal changes in placental tissue and cord blood. So they're the findings that they've got at the moment. Now, to sort of highlight strengths and weaknesses of of cohort studies through this case study, we'll sort of look at strengths and weaknesses. So this specific study had a variety of strengths and weaknesses. One specific strength being that it had repeated physiological, clinical, and omics measures, which integrate cellular mechanics with molecular mechanisms of aging. It also has the ability to explore air pollution on biological factors. Another strength of this study is that it was retrospective in the terms of air pollution measurement and prospective in terms of the biological factors. It also combined with the general cohort strength studies. So the fact that they can look at multiple exposures off this, and from that can demonstrate a direction of causality. Some specific weaknesses of sorry, I believe I dropped out there. So some specific weaknesses of this study is that there's no current quantitative or qualitative measure of a good aging or what defines good aging. So this stems from a lack of extensive research into aging and the ability to effectively measure aging. Whilst we're getting better at measuring aging through DNA, there's no large body of work behind this area when compared to epidemiology, where, for example, if you have a disease or you don't, it's quite black and white. Another weakness of this is the recall or selection bias in the questionnaires. With the selection bias, basically, because the mothers were pregnant when recruited, they had a variety of lifestyle changes. For example, they were not smoking, they were not drinking, hopefully they weren't doing drugs, and most of them would have been eating a lot healthier than they usually would. And so this sort of skews the selection towards a healthier cohort. This, in combined with the other general cohort weaknesses, is that it's quite costly and time consuming, and also prone to loss of follow-up, which is shown in the paper already that they've only got around 10% follow-up. Now, to summarize everything that we've learnt today in a simple visual we have here, basically for cohort study designs, we can go longitudinal, observational, or analytical. Who do we get into these studies? Well, we can get aging and birth groups, disease groups, or social and cultural groups, or people of a political group as well. Type of cohort studies include retrospective and prospective studies. Why do we do the studies, and how are the results calculated? Well, why do we do them is so we can calculate incidence and association, as well as relative risk. We get incidence via dividing your incidence of exposed by total exposed, or incidence of unexposed via total unexposed. From that, we can calculate relative risk, as Casper spoke with before. Now, here we have another visual to finish off, which basically just takes us through a design summary of a cohort study, where we start with a cohort that is disease-free to start with. We work through exposed and unexposed groups. And as I said before, they either one develop disease, so they would be exposed with an outcome, or exposed without an outcome, so disease-free. Same for unexposed group. From there, we can figure out our incident rate and our risk ratio. To finish off, we'd like to prompt you guys to ask any questions, and hopefully we can answer all of them to the best of our ability. Thanks for listening today, guys. I hope you guys learned a bit about cohort studies. Thanks.
Cheers.